Booktube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads video for 5 books I've read. Julian Barnes' new book, Elisabeth Finch. Betty Boo, one of Claudia Pineiro's crime thrillers. Claudia Pineiro wrote Elena Knows, and I was intrigued to go back to her earlier crime thriller novels, of which this is one. A poetry collection by British queer poet Peter Scalpello. This is called Limbic, and I first saw it on Bob the Booker's channel. The Tomb Guardians, a novel by Paul Griffiths, which I first saw Brian at Bookish talk about. And finally, Pod by Layleen Paul, who wrote The Bees. I'm going to give this a separate video because I can use it as a jumping off point to discuss anthropomorphic novels. So I won't be reviewing this in this video. It'll be a separate one, as I say. Okay, so the first book I'm going to talk about is Julian Barnes, Elisabeth Finch. The eponymous heroine is a middle-aged academic lecturer who teaches mature students, and she does a nice line in philosophy, history, morality. She's very epigrammatic in her style. She leaps between all sorts of historical and literary sources all throughout history, and all her students are sort of swept up in her and inspired to sort of change their thinking and stuff. And we have one particular called Neil, who's the narrator of this book. So part one is establishing their relationship, her teaching. We get some philosophy and stuff. She may be a reasonably interesting character with some reasonably interesting ideas. At least that's how I finished part one. Although she dies, it's not a spoiler. She dies, through natural causes. So part two, Neil, who has never been able to complete any project in his life, decides he's going to write an essay on one of the key historical figures that he took from Elisabeth Finch's lectures, and that is a Roman emperor called Julian the Apostate, who tried to hold back the tide of Christianity in order to preserve the classical antiquity of Rome and Greece, but because that also meant preserving their pagan gods, he was swept away by the tide of Christianity. But Neil is determined to write an extended essay on Julian the Apostate. And while it's quite interesting in the sources, it draws on, in a way, quite similar to this book, The Tomb Guardians, that I'm going to come to talk about. There are two big problems with part two. First of all, it's very dry and academic. It is an essay. And it's not literary, by which I mean, yes, it's, because it's Julian Barnes who can turn a nice sentence, it's literary in that sense, but it's not fiction, it's a dry essay. And second of all, you've established the eponymous heroine in part one as a character who may be worth digging further into, and yet part two is entirely taken up with Neil and this personal quest to actually finish something, and a huge in-depth detail of Julian the Apostate, both men. So the book has been taken away from the female character, and it's as if Barnes is much more comfortable talking about the geezers, the men, and I found that quite unsatisfactory. And then we come to part three, which Neil, having finished the essay, decides he's going to try and write a biography of Elisabeth Finch, having told us several times that biographies are very hard to do because it's very hard to genuinely know anyone. Elisabeth Finch was particularly all about her privacy and her unknowability, really. He didn't know what her sexuality was, he didn't know if she had relationships, and Neil tries to unpick this and see what he can come up with, and forms a friendship with Elisabeth's brother, and gets a few nuggets of information. But Neil and as a proxy for Barnes tells you can't ever really know anyone, so why are we doing a biography? It's again very, very unsatisfactory. One of the things that's revealed in this part three is that the one time that Elisabeth had her privacy penetrated and punctured was when she was delivering a lecture, and it was picked up in the media, something, I can't even remember what it was now, something controversial she said, and she became the centre of a media storm. This is before the age of social media. This is a newspaper media storm, which is barely credible. remembering back to those times. But even allowing for it, the fact that that's not revealed until part 3 just doesn't work. I mean, structurally I understand why Barnes took that decision, but actually it doesn't work because it's such a big event and the only revelation of her private life, or her private life becoming public, that it would have come out in part 1. Neil attended that lecture. Neil knew all about the media storm. It's not like he uncovered it in part 3. He experienced it secondhand. So he knew about it as he's describing their relationship in life, but never mentions it in part 1. I just don't buy that. This book is an utter failure. Is she a reasonably interesting character with reasonably interesting ideas? Well, they sound interesting, some of them, and the epigrammatic style helps in that the deliverability of them. But to give you an example, she cites the martyrdom of Saint Ursula, and sort of takes this sort of fairly limited documentary evidence of what it was, but she puts her own modern spin on it because she calls it a martyrdom, which is actually a suicide by cop, because Saint Ursula knew that if she went to Cologne at the end of a pilgrimage, that she would die there, and therefore, despite pleas from other people that she shouldn't go, along with her suitor, who was a pagan, and supposedly 11,000 virgins on this pilgrimage, although that's obviously a mistranslation or a misunderstanding, they do go to Cologne and they get massacred by the Huns who are besieging the city. Now, the Huns are pagans. They are not cops. They are besiegers. They're not in control of. They're in control of parts of Europe, but they don't have the extent of power that, say, the old Roman Empire did. So they're not cops. So it's not suicide by cop. Yes, you can say the suicide part is true because she knew she was going to die there, but it doesn't. So actually, it doesn't hold scrutiny at all. So I begin to question whether actually she is even that interesting. And Julian the Apostle was sort of vaguely interesting, but in isolation, I'm not interested in sort of Christian history and the history of martyrdom and the struggle between paganism and the onset of Christianity. So the dry delivery of it in part 2 didn't work. But again, just to give you an idea of why this book doesn't work. So Neil is talking about the sources that he uses for this essay on Julian, and decides that he's not going to go to the trouble of any of the sort of modern interpretations through opera and stage plays and things like this. When you read a Wikipedia entry of some historical figure, and then right at the end it will be modern day in culture, how these figures have sort of lived to the modern day out of the historical context, but may get used in films or graphic novels or songs or their reference. So that's sort of what Neil's talking about. He can't be bothered to go into these things, which is fine. But then you ask, well, that's exactly what Julian Barnes has done, which has reproduced a modern version of the story of Julian Julian the Apostle. And why should we bother in the same way as why should Neil bother with modern, It doesn't have any weight and gravitas except a tiny, tiny, tiny few academics and people interested in sort of early Christian history and stuff. So in the same way as Neil couldn't be bothered to go to the trouble, I'm not sure that we should here either. As I say, the whole of part 2 is devoted to Julian the Apostle. It just doesn't work. It doesn't hold. The 3 parts do not hold together, and ultimately parts 2 and 3 subvert the female spotlight that I thought this book was going to be. So 2 stars. And on to Claudia Pineiro's Betty Boo. As I say, I read Eleanor Knows, my favourite book of the year so far, but she's mainly known for sort of crime thrillers, of which this is one. And I have to say, and so I was intrigued to see what it was like. I have to say this is an above average crime thriller book. A man who lives in a gated community, which is a big theme for her. She's done it in other books of hers and as a sort of symptomatic of the divide between rich and poor in Argentina. And the book starts with the cleaning lady who lets herself into the apartment, but all the rigmarole she has to pass through in order to be given access to this gated community. And she discovers the body of her employer, who has died in exactly the same way as his wife had a few years earlier. And most people had assumed that he'd killed the wife. and yet here he is dead, murdered, not suicide, murdered in exactly the same way. So that's the setup. We don't have, it's not really a police investigation because it's regarded as suicide, as was the wife's ultimately. But we get a group of journalists and a fiction writer, crime fiction writer, who get on the case because they don't believe that it's suicide. And we get some interesting insight into the difference between new and old policing. New policing being digital, online, and there's a sort of young buck guy who uses Google and all sorts of geolocation stuff, and the old hand, the old timer who he's supplanted in the newspaper office, who's going, no, you've got to be like a detective. It's all sort of gumshoe work, even as a journalist. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then you get the fictional element of storytelling and narrative to piece it all together, of the crime writer. So the three of them sort of get on the case, and I'm not going to give spoilers, but basically it's bigger than the murder of this one guy and his wife. It's wider than that. They discover a link to other murders. And for me, if you're not writing metaphysical detective fiction, the other thing I'm really interested in is where you sort of have these sort of unseen forces in society, a sort of like a minotaur in a society that demands its sacrifice of murders and stuff. Leonardo Sciascia, the Italian 1970s onwards detective thriller writer, very much wrote in that vein, because all the various forces in operation in Italy at the time, of the communists, the fascists, the anarchists, the Masons, the Catholic Church, all these sort of groups underneath the official ruling Christian Democrats, and that between this sort of chemistry of how these groups were interlocked and fitted together and predated upon each other, you had this sort of unseen, all-consuming force of murder and mayhem. This is not dissimilar. Obviously, it's on the Argentinian model, though. So yeah, very good. 4 stars. On to Limbic by Peter Scalpello. I enjoyed this. It's a very good, solid collection. 4 stars. There was quite a few poems about chemsex. I'm against chem anything. Maybe one day I'll do a video on why I am. But this intrigued me enough to actually go up, because I don't really know anything about chemsex. So I was quite intrigued to go. I think I will be intrigued to go read up a bit more. There's some references in the back, if they're available online. I will read them, because although I struggle to get my head around anything chemically induced or boosted, he made it. He asked me questions of my sort of stance on the matter. There's one brilliant bit where he's talking about group sex, and he describes himself as the keynote in this group sex. And I love that usage of word, which I found very typical in this book throughout. That, like a keynote speaker at a conference, he was the keynote in a group sex session. So this is very, very solid. 4 stars. And on to the last book I'm going to talk about in this video, The Tomb Guardians. And what a delightful surprise this was. It looks at a triptych, although there was a missing 4th piece, altarpiece, which was made in early 16th century Germany. And 3 of them are in a museum in Munich together, but the 4th somehow has ended up in the museum in York, in the north of England. And it's a triptych of the supposed tomb guardians who were placed outside, is it Gethsemane, where Christ was taken, his body was taken after he was crucified, and he rose from the cave, or whatever it is, 3 days later. And it's a mixture of an art critic delivering a lecture or reciting a lecture on these panels, and he's very unsure about their provenance. Not in terms of, he's not doubting that they date back to 16th century Germany, but the provenance in terms of what actually these panels are showing, because they're not dressed as Roman soldiers, they're dressed as contemporary 16th century German members of a town watch. And the provenance, as he's discussing it throughout this book, is, were there, is this anything to do with the tomb guardians of that time from sort of Christ's life, and it talks about the war between Protestant and Catholicism, and how Protestantism sort of ushered in a wave of individualism and the individual dress of these soldiers and everything. And it's a really interesting set of ideas in a subject I wouldn't normally have picked up. But what makes it really interesting is this is intercut with an imagined dialogue between the remaining three Tomb Guardians. It's assumed that the fourth one from the panel that's missing has also sort of stormed off, and they know they're in trouble because they had one job, which was to guard the cave, and they've woken up and Christ has gone, and obviously they weren't supposed to be asleep, and they're saying we're for the high jump. What can we do to save ourselves? So there's an ongoing discussion, quite a sort of, again, a waiting for Godot like fashion, even though there's three of them, not two, as to how they can save their skins and the various stories they try and come up with to explain it, which echoes and intercuts beautifully with what the lecturer is saying as he's doubting the provenance of the story of what this painting is supposedly saying. And it's just really, really, it was an absolute delightful treat. I wasn't expecting it. It's a very short read, but I was just swept along by it, swept into its world. I gave it 5 stars. Delightful. And as I said, I'm not going to talk about Pod, but I gave it 2 stars. So that really, in a very mixed bag week, this was very much a sort of saving grace. I mean, I did enjoy Betty Boo, but it was within its genre, and I did enjoy Limbic as well. But the real sort of discovery, I suppose, was the Tomb Guardian. And quickly, just what I'm going on to read. So 2 books. The Jennifer Egan is due to arrive in a week Saturday, so I won't be getting to it in the coming week. So I thought to fill the gap, I will either or both read Sasa Stanisic's novel Where You Come From, which was translated from the German by Damien Searles, and this is his new book, came out last year. It's his 3rd novel. I've only read the first one, which is The Soldier Repairs the Gramophone, which is great. He's a refugee from the Yugoslavian civil war. And Zena over at Beat About the Books very, very kindly gifted me this as a sort of Christmas present or whatever. So I'm looking forward to getting to that. And I know it depends how quickly I get through, whichever one I go first. This is David Martson's book called Going Down. This was published first published in 1970. So as you probably know, long-time viewers, David Martson's my favourite author for very, very experimental works, which sort of came out in the 90s and just into the 2000s after he died. But he started off as a jobbing writer, sort of writing to briefs, really. For sort of, I've never read any of them, but sort of Western type novels, that sort of stuff. This novel sort of, I think, represents a transition between writing, to prescription, but not. He hasn't discovered his experimental voice. So this is this wasn't. I don't think this was a paid gig, writing to a brief. I think this is genuinely his own creative project, but it hasn't hit the development of his much more radical experimental style some 20 years later. But I'm looking forward to reading it because I'm so into David Martson. While I won't read the stuff he wrote for paid gigs, I do want to read this just to get a sense of how we go from here to Wittgenstein's Mistress and This Is Not a Novel and Reader's Block and all those sorts of genius books. So those are my sort of intended next 2 reads. Okay, thanks very much. Till next time.